Hello, today we are going to discuss the book The Invention of the Jewish People. Published in 2008, the author, Shlomo Sand, is a professor and historian at Tel Aviv University in Israel. Through this book, he early on proposed to the world that the so-called Jewish people are actually a fictional concept. Sand's academic courage and insight have been widely praised, but he has also been regarded as an enemy of Israel by some. Before 2023, when we talked about Israel, we would usually say that it is a country of Jews. When mentioning Jews, many people would think of positive traits such as intelligence, shrewdness, piety, wealth, and diligence. We believe that the Jewish people have a long history of thousands of years, especially since the expulsion of Jews from their ancestral lands in 70 AD. They no longer have their own country and can only live in other nations, drifting and unstable. At this time, we might admire their resilience and perseverance even more. For 2,000 years, without their own land and home, other nations might have disappeared long ago. However, Jews have been able to maintain their national characteristics, which is admirable. However, if someone told you at that time that Jews are not a nation at all, and their history of rise and fall and wandering is all fabricated, would you be surprised? This is the core viewpoint that Sand puts forward in the book The Invention of the Jewish People. As an Israeli citizen, Sand has a stable job and no direct conflict of interest with the Israeli authorities. So, why did he write such a controversial book? It all starts with his family background. Sand's parents were Polish Jews, but they abandoned Judaism and believed in communism. This had a profound influence on Sand. As he grew up, he gradually formed an opposition to the official ideology of Israel and to Jewish nationalism. This ideology advocates that Israel is a state for Jews and must suppress and exclude the Palestinians living on this land. Sand believes that this attitude not only violates justice and the trend of history but is also the root of instability in the Middle East. During his tenure at the university, he felt sympathy for Palestinian students without Israeli nationality, so he wrote this book to expose the lies of the official ideology. After The Invention of the Jewish People, Sand also published a book called Why I Stopped Being a Jew. In the book, he declared that he could not bear the fictional national identity imposed on him by Israeli law, as well as Israel's self-proclaimed superiority as the chosen people of God, so he decided to give up his Jewish identity and no longer consider himself a Jew. He wrote The Invention of the Jewish People to oppose Jewish nationalism, and giving up his Jewish identity further shows his attitude of completely dissolving Jewishness, looking forward to a secular, non-exclusive, and Israel identity that transcends Jewish nationalism. Next, let's explore the core content of this book from three aspects: who fabricated the myth of the Jewish people, why they fabricated it, and what results this fabrication has achieved. First, let's look at the first question: what makes us mistakenly believe that Jews are a nation? The answer is the Bible. More precisely, it is the Bible of the Jews, also known as the Old Testament. Jews have been reading the Old Testament for generations. This book starts from the creation of the world by God, stating that the Jewish people originated from the 10 tribes of Abraham. Abraham begot Isaac, Isaac begot Jacob, and Jacob begot Joseph, gradually evolving into a nation. Later, Moses led the Jews out of Egypt and back to the region of Judea on the eastern coast of the Mediterranean. At this time, the Jews had become the chosen people of God and made a covenant with God, obeying the laws promulgated by God. In the following history, the Jews established their own country around Jerusalem, had 2 kings named David and Solomon, and then experienced division and decline. The ancient Jews were once expelled from their homeland, and then returned in succession, but were ultimately suppressed by the Romans in 70 AD and exiled to other places. Since then, for nearly 2,000 years, the Jews have never truly returned to their ancestral homeland. This land is called Judea in the Bible and was later renamed to the familiar Palestine. From this, it can be seen that according to the content of the Bible, the origin of the Jewish people, early stories, glorious period, decline, and the history of exile are all very clear. This detailed historical record makes people feel that the existence of this nation is undoubtedly. However, were the historians writing at the time of the event or were they recorded by later generations? The answer is obviously the latter. Therefore, the so-called history is more or less a storytelling component, and storytelling inevitably involves adding some fictional content. Next, Sand asks us to think with common sense. According to the records of the Old Testament, the early Jews were in the process of transitioning from nomadic tribes to settled agricultural societies. Most people, whether shepherds or farmers, had low cultural levels and almost no knowledge. Many times, they just obeyed the leaders, and there may have been a language barrier between them and the leaders, and their actions were slow. A farmer who has been farming all his life may never have seen what a king looks like. Do they really think they belong to a nation? Sand quotes a sentence in the preface of the book: "A nation is a group of people connected by a common memory of their ancestors and a common aversion to their history." This sounds a bit extreme, but Sand means that so-called nations are artificially created concepts, aimed at establishing emotional ties among a group of people, making each member feel that they have a common ancestor, thus generating a sense of belonging, and willing to serve this group. So, if the Jews of that time were not considered a nation, how did they come together? Sand said they believed in the same religion, Judaism. 2,000 or 3,000 years ago, the power of religion was the strongest. It was the Jewish clergy, these cultured, intelligent, and language-capable people, who spread the idea of "we are a community among the people." Religious beliefs made all people in the ethnic group believe in the same God, but they may not understand their own tribal leaders or kings. Since the Old Testament has obvious storytelling characteristics, why is it regarded as the true history of the Jews, thus fabricating a Jewish nation? This is the second core issue we need to discuss. Why is there such a fabrication? Sand tells us that in fact, in the past 2,000 years, few people have regarded the Old Testament as completely pure history. Even when Jews read the Bible, preach the Bible, and worship God according to the Bible, the Old Testament is also a religious text that contains history, not real history, just like the mythological stories in our country's classic of mountains and seas. However, in the latter half of the 19th century, some European Jewish intellectual elites believed that Jews must end the days without land and country, otherwise they will eventually perish. They initiated a movement called Zionism, aiming to mobilize Jews all over the world to find a place to establish a country. Where was this place finally chosen? It was chosen in the Palestinian region. According to the description of the Old Testament, Palestine was the place where the Jews rose 2,000 or 3,000 years ago. They established their own country there and created a brilliant history. In the Bible, this place is called Judea. In this way, if the stories in the Bible are all true, it seems reasonable for Jews to return to this land, and it can also stimulate the enthusiasm of Jews. It is not a land without people living in it, there are Palestinians living there. If Jews want to go there, they will definitely conflict with them, so it is very necessary for Jews to determine Palestine as the ancestral land of the Jews. Zionists have done a lot of work. They told influential figures that Palestine is indeed their ancestral land. Their ancestors were completely driven out by the Romans in 70 AD, and they have not returned in large numbers since then, and can only miss the great Jerusalem created by their ancestors from generation to generation. And this history is not completely fictional, it is recorded, mainly based on the Jewish War written by the Jewish historian Josephus in the 1st century AD. However, Sand pointed out that although the Roman suppression of the Jews in 70 AD did occur, the ancient Jews were expelled from their ancestral lands, which is an artificially created myth. The concept of exile, like the Jewish nation, is also fictional, because the Romans never exiled all the conquered people. Sand gave 3 reasons. First, in terms of the productivity of that era, expelling all the conquered people would greatly reduce the population and taxpayers, which is not cost-effective for the rulers. Second, the Romans had the conditions to brutally suppress the rebels, but they did not have the conditions to expel all the conquered people, because they did not have modern trucks, trains, or large warships. Finally, Josephus's The Jewish War has many doubts as a historical material. Josephus lived 2,000 years ago and was a survivor of the Roman suppression of the Jews, and later lived in the Roman Empire. So how did he understand the overall situation of the Jews at that time? His data is a lot of exaggeration, such as he said that there were 1 million people in Jerusalem at that time who were killed by the Romans. He also did not use archaeological materials to explain that the residents of Jerusalem at that time were only 60,000 to 70,000. Most importantly, even Josephus did not say that the Romans exiled the Jews. Therefore, the concept of exile is also fictional, and its purpose is to prove that the Jews have historical rights to the Palestinian region and to prove that their return is reasonable. After exposing these fabrications, Sand continues to answer a key question. If the Jews were not exiled, where did the Jews living on their ancestral lands 2,000 years ago go? The answer goes back to Judaism. Although there is no so-called Jewish nation, Judaism does exist. Anyone who believes in Judaism becomes a Jew. Sand cites a large amount of data to prove that the Jews at that time were not driven to other places, but changed their beliefs for survival. Between 300 and 400 AD, Christianity rose and became the state religion of the Byzantine Empire, and some Jews converted to Christianity. Later, in the 7th century AD, Islam rose in the Arabian Peninsula, and between 638 and 643 AD, the Islamic army occupied Palestine. Sand pointed out that because the Jews were treated more tolerantly under Islamic forces than in the past, the Jews in Palestine converted to Islam on a large scale. This conclusion will naturally cause a sensation, as it is well known that the relationship between the Jewish state of Israel in the Middle East and the surrounding Islamic countries has always been tense. Since the establishment of Israel 70 years ago, the two sides have fought several major battles, and small conflicts have been continuous. In the book, Sand asserts that historically, Jews once converted to Islam, which is emotionally difficult for many people to accept. So who are the descendants of these Jews who converted to Islam? Sand continues to make an astonishing inference. He says they are the Palestinians of today. Sand cites some scholars' research, proving that the colloquial language of the Palestinians retains a large number of biblical terms, and their place names all come from the Bible, indicating that they have a close cultural connection with the ancient Jews. If Palestine is the land of the Jewish ancestors, then the Palestinians are the legitimate descendants of these ancestors. However, the facts are exactly the opposite. The Zionist movement has always ignored the Palestinians from the beginning, only emphasizing their right to return. In 1948, the establishment of Israel completely sacrificed the interests of the Palestinians. Their land was occupied, their houses were demolished, and they could only live in areas designated by the Jews or work for the Jews. After the establishment of Israel, most Palestinians are still second-class citizens, unable to obtain Israeli nationality, and few can enter the upper levels of society, let alone integrate into the Jewish community. The official ideology of Israel usually ignores the existence of the Palestinians, emphasizing that it is a Jewish state. When talking about the situation of the Palestinian indigenous people in 1948, the Israeli official will say that they are not a nation, just some scattered Arab farmers, and we Jews have always been a nation, and we have historical rights to this land. Well, let's summarize here. Sand points out that the Jews are a nation with a long history, and that the Jews were expelled from Judea by the Romans in 70 AD and never returned to their homeland. These are two myths, deliberately created by Zionists. The purpose is to find a basis for the establishment of a Jewish state in Palestine and to gain international support. Sand said that in fact, the Jews did not return to Palestine legally, but established the State of Israel through colonization. Sand also answered a question: who are the Jews who came to Palestine? Are they really the descendants of the Jews? Sand's answer is that they are indeed Jews, but they are not the so-called descendants of the ancestors, but come from other places. As mentioned before, religious belief is a personal choice, which can be changed, given up, or converted. The Jews in Palestine once converted to Islam, and people from other places can also convert to Judaism and become Jews. Sand pointed out that for a long time before 70 AD, there were indeed a large number of Jewish groups outside the Palestinian region, some of which even formed a country. This is proven by a lot of historical materials and archaeological evidence. So are these groups expelled from Palestine? Sand said no, they are formed by the local people after converting to Judaism. Today, Judaism does not proselytize. However, from the 2nd century BC to the 2nd century AD, Judaism actively expanded outward. Judaism is the earliest monotheistic religion in history. People who believe in Judaism will spread this belief to others, telling others that they can only believe in one God, and other gods are false. If the proselytized do not obey, they may be expelled. Therefore, the existence of Jews is the result of missionary work. Sand cites historical materials to prove that the trend of Jewish missionary work continued until the early 4th century AD. In the entire argumentation process, Sand not only used various research materials from predecessors, but also made extensive use of common sense. He repeatedly reminds readers not to overestimate the mobility of ancient people. At that time, people did not have the convenient transportation we have today, and it was not easy for them to take root in a place to live. If converting or changing a religion can stabilize their lives, they would tend to do so. Sand is convinced that the Jews did not go into exile in large numbers, but Judaism spread in various places and created new Jews. Those who returned to their homeland are the result of this religious dissemination. He tells us that these people mainly come from Eastern Europe. At the beginning of the 2nd century, the Jewish people in Eastern Europe formed a large group with similar languages, almost becoming a nation. According to historical records, from the 16th to the 17th century to the 1930s of the 2nd century, the population of Jews in Eastern Europe continued to grow, and they gathered in Russia, Poland, Ukraine, Romania, Lithuania, and Latvia, and other places. The size and influence of their group far exceed other regions. There were as many as 750,000 Jews in Poland alone in the 18th century, and why is that? Why did Jews gather in Eastern Europe? As mentioned earlier, Jews were formed by believing in Judaism. Sand cites various materials to infer that in the 8th century AD, the Khazar kingdom in Central Asia accepted Judaism as the official religion, which created the Khazars. This kingdom existed between the 8th and 12th centuries, located between the Caspian Sea and the Black Sea. After the fall of the Khazar kingdom, Jews wandered to Eastern Europe and gathered there. Although there are not many historical records about the Khazar kingdom, Sand points out that only by acknowledging the existence of the Khazar kingdom can we explain why there are so many Jews in Eastern Europe. Sand mentioned that the Jewish group in Eastern Europe almost formed a nation. They established the prototype of social division of labor and political structure, and they had a unique cultural life. Most importantly, Yiddish has become their common language. It is a key sign of forming a nation, and only the unification of language can allow a group of people to communicate without barriers and form a community. However, these Jewish nations formed through religious dissemination are essentially different from the Jews who multiplied from the biblical homeland 2,000 years ago. Well, here Sand explains who fabricated the myth of the Jewish nation, why it was fabricated, and what impact this myth has brought. The Zionist movement turned a fictional story into a historical fact, promoting the belief that an ancient nation returned to its homeland, but in fact, this nation does not exist at all. The so-called Jewish nation is just a group of people who believe in Judaism. Some of them once converted to other religions, and people from other places can also convert to Judaism to become Jews. That is to say, Jews are a constantly changing group, and there is no fixed and unchanging nation. The story of returning to the ancestral land after 3 years is just a legend. In the book The Invention of the Jewish People, Sand praises the leaders of Zionism in an affirmative tone, saying that they are meticulous in thinking and decisive in handling affairs, and can skillfully use forms to achieve goals, but these cannot turn fictional things into reality. The fact is that the Zionist movement used fictional historical narratives to establish an ideology, using this to colonize Palestine and suppress the local people. According to this ideology, Palestinians are ignored, and their right to exist is considered unimportant. Sand raises a simple question: if Jews still have the right to their ancestral land after being absent for 2,000 years, then should the Palestinians who have lived here for 1,200 years not be protected a little? Although Sand refutes lies and myths, he is not a radical scholar. He does not advocate that Jews should withdraw from this land, but believes that Israel should abandon its Jewish state identity, so that Palestinians can also identify with Israel and enjoy the right to live together. Sand cites historical cases, pointing out that various grievances and hatreds after occupation and conquest need to be resolved through reason and wisdom. For example, the United States illegally deprived the indigenous people of their land during the process of establishing the country, but no one said that the United States should not exist. Britain was conquered by the Normans 1,000 years ago, and later no one asked to drive the Normans away. Israel has achieved success in war and conquest, and it is better to urge Israel to accept the ignored Palestinians than to belittle these achievements. Therefore, Sand believes that giving up the identity of a Jewish state is the most beneficial for both Palestinians and Jews. Sand's views have caused a great controversy in Israel. Religious conservatives consider him a traitor and cannot accept his belittlement of the authenticity of the Old Testament, let alone the equality of Jews and Palestinians. They think Sand is just a naive left-wing intellectual, ignoring his argumentation. Sand frankly says that he himself is an Israeli and has no intention of challenging the Israeli government or inciting hatred. The main motivation for him to write this book is that he is not convinced, and he has witnessed the plight of Palestinian students and felt their pain. This country does not recognize them as equal citizens, and they find it difficult to base themselves on other countries. They feel inferior in front of Jewish students, but they cannot find a way to get rid of their inferiority. Sand asks, why can Jews live comfortably in the United States, but Palestinians cannot stay comfortably in Israel? Well, we have almost finished talking about the book The Invention of the Jewish People. In summary, Sand believes that the so-called Jewish nation is a pseudo-concept that is fabricated. Jews are not as people generally think, they have been a nation since the Old Testament times. All concepts of nations are narratives given by later generations, serving the current purposes. When the Zionist movement needed to mobilize Jews from all over the world to go to Palestine, they created this narrative, claiming that this is the return to their homeland, but this is a fabricated myth. Jews did not go into exile, so they cannot talk about returning. As a result, they only occupied the land of the Palestinians, and the real descendants of the Jewish ancestors are actually the Palestinians, who are suffering unfair treatment. Well, thank you for listening to another book. See you next time.